Question 2. How did we represent particular social groups through our sequence? So, initially we conceived a story, and that's a good point to start, because before we thought through the character and we built the character, we thought of the story. And in general, although we all pictured it in our heads differently and in our own manners, but I think we all agreed on a basic and simple concept, which would be a teenager running away from home. And that in itself raises a very important social issue, which is teenagers leaving home. So on that basis, we had a lot to build our character around. So we started by building our character on a very stereotypical representation of a teenager, that of the rebellious teenager, which we see a lot in media. And but we expanded this stereotype. We didn't completely build on it. We envisaged something else, something which isn't common in mainstream media. What we did was, for starters, we didn't picture the character as a girl. And that was from the beginning. We didn't develop it through and reach a conclusion to be a boy. I think we all agreed that it should be a boy. And the use of a boy did turn out to be very important. And we weren't quite aware of that at the time, but it was very important because we often see girls in this position, at least in mainstream cinema. And it's quite interesting to study various Hollywood films such as Juno or Cyberbully and all these, and then to look at more independent productions like LIE and Bang Bang You're Dead and all these other. And even looking at classic Hollywood films like Rebel Without a Cause, it was interesting to see similarities and differences and the way these conventions and the character and the stereotyping evolved. So the use of the boy instead of the girl was really important. It made our cinema return to that classic principle of using the boy. I think in those times it was more because boys were seen as active while females were meant to be at home, and so the media tried to portray that. But in a way, as media evolved, we start seeing girls in that position, and that's sort of become very stereotypical. So, it's funny because we went back, in a way, to break modern conventions by going back to old conventions, which is quite interesting. At least the films we saw were like that. But for our film, our sequence to show that, to show a boy in that position of a victim, of someone who has to run away from some problem, it leaves a lot for the audience to imagine. And it wasn't clear, the exact message we wanted to send through. But with our character, by showing a character which is running away from something, we get this idea that he's going away from this physical place to another physical place, which is more appealing to the eye. But we get the sense that the character is more complex than we show him. And it's funny enough because the character is quite simple in the way he's been built and the way he's been constructed. And so, the physical spaces which are symbolical for change and for transgression and from this boy running away from home, it becomes something much more larger. So, interesting enough, although we didn't think these aspects true, in terms of racial and ethnic representations, I think the use of the white boy and not the ethnic minority was kind of interesting. Although it kind of depended on the actor we used for great parts, we didn't think this true. But in a way, and me ending up having to act kind of worked well. Yes. The problem then doesn't become something about race or culture. We focus solely on the problem. And another aspect, and another perspective to this, in a way, by showing, I'd say, member of a majority, in this case an ethnic majority, we sort of represent the problem in its every aspect. It's not only a problem of this or that race, it's a universal problem. It's a problem which happens to black, white, Chinese, whatever. whatever ethnic minority or majority, it happens in these groups. We could have represented culture and race in another film, but with this, I think the individuality and his relation to his parents would be something we'd explore throughout the film. And in our opening sequence, I think that's very hinted. So it's all around the problem, it's all around the home and the issue rather than on the character himself. The character represents a large range of people by being simple and by in a way not purposefully representing them. It seems complicated, but it's not. We built on this simple concept so that each teenager in a way could relate to that boy. That in terms of ethnicity. So ethnicity, in terms of gender, we used a boy rather than a girl, and in terms of ethnicity, we used a member of a white majority, which is, at least in the case of British, for the British public. But in a different level, in different aspects, and perhaps this is just in my head, but at least that's the way I made my personal connection to the character. The audience, from what we denote, this is what we denote. It's a boy, and he's from a majority, an ethnic majority. But in terms of a different aspect, which is his sexuality, we show a boy which could be perceived as active in taking action or passive as in running away from a problem. It depends on the audience's own perspective on the action. So one could perhaps infer that, but everything is connoted, but one could infer that the character is gay or bisexual, or maybe this is the struggle. Now we know from statistics that people from this group are particularly affected by this social problem, and so perhaps we could explore that throughout the film. For now it's only hinted, but in a way we also cover that aspect. It could be read by an LGBT audience in that manner, and therefore we approach a much wider and much broader spectrum in society. So, in terms of the audience and the way the audience could interpret our character, I think this is where cultural backgrounds and social frameworks are important, and this is perhaps how the audience connects to our character, through their own personal feelings and their own personal experiences. Now, in another aspect, I think social class, and in terms of economics, and in terms of where the character would be placed in in society, I think that we don't make it obvious, but we do hint that the character comes from a middle-class family, and or from a perhaps lower middle-class family, and going into a more higher middle-class house, from the locations and from the settings and from everything. So in that aspect, we show that these type of problems don't only affect the rich boys or the poor boys, but also the middle ground, the middle class boys. And in that manner, we aren't portraying a stereotypical mainstream perspective on rebellion, which they rebel against their parents because of money, but instead a middle-class family with normal problems like everyone else has. This, I think, was very important because this character ultimately reaches out to every member of the audience, and it makes our character much more relatable to in general, and so he represents society and more aspects of society than if we had put him in a higher or lower social class, or with specific traits of ethnicity or gender, or not gender, or sexuality, or by making sure that our concept was simple and that our character was simple and that everything could be connoted by the audience and that the audience had a lot of room to interpret the character. I think we reached out more and represented more social aspects, and ultimately represented more people in our sequel. And that's it.